AWS CodeDeploy is a deployment service that automates deployment to Amazon EC2 instances, serverless Lambda functions, or Amazon ECS services. It scales with your infrastructure, making it easy to deploy to one instance or multiple. In this video, let's explore AWS CodeDeploy, what it is, some of the core concepts, and how to use it to deploy a .NET application. Hello everyone, my name is Rahul and welcome back to this YouTube channel. If you're new here, I make videos on .NET, Cloud, and DevOps. This video is sponsored by AWS and is part of my Amazon EC2 series. We will be using the same code sample which we used in the previous video where we set up the GitHub Actions build deploy pipeline for this ASP.NET API to an Amazon EC2 instance. I highly recommend checking that video if you're completely new to deploying to EC2 instances and also setting up GitHub Actions. To do a quick recap, here we have a CDK project that sets up the infrastructure required to deploy the .NET application, which in this case is the EC2 instances, and we also have the actual My API. This API was deployed as a systemd service running as a service on our Linux machines. Now we also have the GitHub Actions workflow file here, which does the steps to deploy the application. At a high level, this sets up the .NET, it builds and publishes the application to the Linux self-contained application, and it also sets the AWS credentials to connect to EC2 instance and deploy it. In this case, we were deploying to two different instances, so we have EC2 instance 1 and also EC2 instance 2. Now, this basically uses SSH and connects and copies the contents and sets up the systemd service. Now, since we are deploying to two different instances, in this case, we had to duplicate out the code for instance 1 and also instance 2. Now, with more instances, you'll have to duplicate this even more, which makes it really a bad choice for this job. This is where AWS CodeDeploy comes into picture. Let's see how we can use AWS CodeDeploy to make these deployments much easier and streamlined without having to duplicate these code and also self-manage this deployment pipeline in our GitHub Actions workflow. CodeDeploy automates application deployments to EC2 instances and also Lambda functions and ECS services. CodeDeploy makes it really easier to rapidly release new features, update AWS Lambda function versions, avoid downtime during application deployment, and also handling the complexity of updating your applications without many risks of manual error-prone deployments. You can use CodeDeploy to deploy to one instance or even thousands of instances. Some of the benefits of using CodeDeploy includes that it targets a wide variety of services like server, which is the EC2, Lambda functions, and also ECS. It helps us to automate deployments, minimize the downtime. It also gives you good control over stopping and rolling back your deployments, and it's very easy to get started with. This also supports concurrent deployments, which means the deployments are much faster when you are deploying to a larger number of instances. Now, when using CodeDeploy, there are a few new terminologies that you need to be familiar with. Now, some of them we will cover in this video, which is application, compute platform, the deployment configuration, deployment group, and deployment type. Some of the others you might be already across, like IAM instance profile, service role, etc. Now, an application in CodeDeploy uniquely identifies the application that you want to deploy. Now, in my case, this is the .NET API application that I'm deploying using CodeDeploy. The compute platform is the different platforms that's supported by CodeDeploy, which we've already seen. They are EC2, Lambda, and also ECS. Main part of CodeDeploy is the deployment configuration. Now, this is a set of deployment rules and success and failure conditions used by CodeDeploy during a deployment. Now, these differs based on the type of compute platform that you use. In this case, we will be seeing the configuration for EC2 instances. You can also specify how traffic is routed during a deployment. You can specify canary, in which case the traffic is shifted in two increments, or you can specify linear, in which case traffic is shifted in equal increments with an equal number of minutes between each increment. The last option that you can use is all at once, in which case the entire traffic is shifted all at once. The deployment group is basically the set of instances that you're deploying to. So if your application is running on one EC2 instance, the deployment group consists of one one instance. However, if you're deploying to multiple instances, then it will be containing all those instances that you're deploying to. The deployment type is basically the method that you use to make the latest application available on instances in the deployment group. So this is where you get to choose whether you do an in-place deployment, which is basically replacing the current instance on the machine. In this case, the application on each instance in the deployment group is stopped and the latest application is installed and then started again. Now, the alternative to this is the blue-green deployment. This is where you would be deploying to a separate set of instances and then switching over the traffic one by one as you see that your deployments are successful. Now, this is slightly different based on the platform, but we will not be diving into this in this video. If you want to learn more about blue-green deployments, do let me know in the comments below. Now that you understand a few of the key concepts in CodeDeploy, let's head off into the AWS console and create a new CodeDeploy application. So let's navigate to my AWS console. Let's navigate to CodeDeploy, which we can do using CodeDeploy, and then navigate to this. Here, we'll start creating an application. So let's navigate on the left side and go to Applications and create an application. Now we can specify an application name. So let's specify my API as the application name. We can also choose the platform. In this case, we're going to deploy to EC2 instances. So let's click Create Application. Now we have successfully created the application and now we have to specify the deployment groups. So let's create a deployment group from here and let's go to the details for that. In this case, we have to again specify a name. So let's specify my API group. Now we need to specify a service role which gives the CodeDeploy the permissions to access the instances. For this, we have to create a new IAM service role. So let's navigate into a new tab in AWS console and let's go to IAM in here. We can create a new service role and use that in our deployment group. So let's go into roles and let's say create role. Now in this case, again, we are going to choose AWS service and select CodeDeploy from this list here. Now we are deploying to CodeDeploy to EC2, so let's select the first option and let's click Next. Now by default, this has already added the required policies. In this case, this is the AWS CodeDeploy rule. You can expand this to see the various permissions that this is giving for your CodeDeploy role and which will be used to access the instances. So let's click Next and let's give this a name. So let's specify my API CodeDeploy and let's click Create Role. This creates the new role which we will be able to use back in our deployment group. So let's refresh this page. Let's make sure to give the deployment name again. And now we have the service role, my API CodeDeploy role that we just created pop up here. So let's select that. Now we need to specify how we want to deploy our application. For this video, to keep it simple, we're going to use in place. Now we are going to use EC2 instances. So let's select Amazon EC2 instances. Now if I open back to the other tab and let's navigate to EC2 instances, and we already have 2 instances from our previous video. Now these are the instances where we were manually deploying to GitHub Actions. Now we will be replacing this to use CodeDeploy. Here we can see 2 instances and both of them belong to AWS EC2 stack. So we can use that to identify these devices. So let's specify the key for these devices as the stack name and let's specify the stack name as AWS EC2 stack. Now this is the stack that we were using in our code. So if you look at the CDK stack, this is also named exactly the same. So this is what is being used to assign those instances. Now in this AWS EC2 stack is where we created the 2 instances and created these in our AWS account. So let's navigate back. Now you can see here that 2 matched instances have been picked up for this specific deployment group based on this tag naming. Now, when we use CodeDeploy, this sets up a CodeDeploy agent on our EC2 instances. So this is automatically installed and also scheduled for updates. So you can configure that using AWS Systems Manager, and we'll leave this to the default. For the deployment configuration, we will choose all at once for now. We will see the other options in future videos. For now, let's turn off load balancer, even though I have got a load balancer in place, but we again will cover this in a different video in the future. Now let's click Create Deployment Group, which is going to create the deployment group. Now that we have the application and the deployment group created, it's ready to deploy our application. Now, if I navigate back to my API, you can see under deployments, we don't have any deployments. This is because we haven't triggered any deployment. Now, you can go and create a deployment from here, but that would be a manual deployment. In our case, what we want is the GitHub Actions to be triggering this deployment. So for this, we will switch back to our application code and start updating our GitHub Actions to deploy using this CodeDeploy application. Now, one of the ways you can send the packages to CodeDeploy is by uploading it to Amazon S3. We will be using that. So let's switch back to our application. And here in our AWS EC2 stack, we're going to create a new S3 bucket. So I have already created the code for that, to which I will be navigating to. So let's open the Git commit and let's check out this revision where I have created the S3 bucket. Now, if you want to see the changes that has happened in this specific commit, let's open that in a diff viewer. And here we can see that this is creating a new bucket. Now, this has the name My CodeDeploy Artifacts bucket. So let's copy that name because we will be using this shortly. Now, this is set up to deploy this to our infrastructure. So when we run CDK deploy, it is going to create this bucket. Now, if I scroll down, I have also added the CFN output, which is actually not necessary, but I've just added it in here in case we want to output the value for this in our CFN. Now, we've also specified the deploy bucket and granted it role to the EC2 instances. This is because the EC2 instances needs to download the application code from this bucket, because of which we have specified a grant read and specified that on the role which we were using to assign to our EC2 instances. So you can see here this role, which is being created inside here, is being assigned to the instance1.role. So now it will also have the permissions to access this S3 bucket and read items from there. So let's close this. Let's do a CDK deploy to update this bucket into our stack. So let's do CDK deploy, which is going to create this S3 bucket and also set up the required permissions on our EC2 instances. The CDK deploy has completed successfully. So if I navigate back into AWS console and let's open a new tab and let's navigate to CloudFormation, and here we can see the details about our latest stack. So if I navigate into that and look at resources, here we also have the S3 bucket, which we just created, which is the My CodeDeploy Artifacts bucket. Now with the bucket created, let's update our GitHub Actions to now push the artifacts to this S3 bucket and then trigger the code deploy. Again, I have created a commit for this. So let's check out that and see what has changed in this. So let's check out revision main, which is the last commit in this I have made. And let's look at the updates that I have made to the GitHub Actions file and also a few other files that I have added. The main changes here was to completely remove off the copy files to EC2 instance 1 and EC2 instance 2. This we were using to set up and deploy to our EC2 instances. We no longer require that. Instead of this, we are just uploading the artifacts to S3. So here you can also see we are using an appspec.yml file and the API servers and a few scripts into the publish folder before we are creating a zip and uploading it to S3. We will shortly look at these three files and see what they do. We are already familiar with the myapi.service file, which we've seen in the previous video. Now, once we have the zip with all these contents, we upload this to S3 and then we trigger a code deploy deployment. Now in this, we are using the AWS deploy, create deployment and specifying the application name, which is the application name of the code deploy. We are also specifying the deployment group name using again a secret code deploy deployment group and specifying the location as the S3 bucket. Now this already has the bucket details and specifying that the type is zip and also the name of that zip. That is the only thing that we need to do to trigger a new deployment for this specific application to this deployment group. Now this is going to use the zip file that we've just uploaded and use that to deploy. So now our GitHub Actions file is so much more shorter and this also handles multiple instances. We didn't have to duplicate these code and copy it over again and again. We also had to add different variables to capture the different host details, which is also no longer required. So let's close this and let's look at the appspec.yml file. The appspec.yml file is a specification file in the YAML format, which is used by CodeDeploy to manage a deployment. Now, based on the compute platform that you're deploying to, this file structure can vary. Now, in case of EC2 platform that we are deploying to, the appspec file must be placed at the root of the directory structure of an application's source code. This is why we made sure to copy this into the outputted artifact folder before bundling that into a zip. We also have associated script folders that contains the various script files that the app spec files points to. So if I was to switch back to our code, in this file we are specifying the files and specifying the source and destination that these files needs to be copied. In this case, the source, which is the entire zip package, is being mapped out to the destination, which is the My API folder under EC2 user. This is where we were manually copying the files earlier in our GitHub actions. We also need to copy the service file into the systemd/system, because of which from the source we are just picking the explicit file, which is myapi.service, and specifying the destination for that to the systemd system folder. So these two will be copied. In this case, it will be recursively copying all the contents in the zip file to this folder, and in the second one, just the service file to the system folder under systemd. Now, once the files are copied, there are different hooks that is being specified. Now, we are mainly using 3 different hooks for this CodeDeploy deployment. They are the before install, the after install, and the application start. Now, there are a lot more hooks that you can use. So if we switch back into the documentation, you can see there is the application stop, the download bundle, before install, after install, application start, etc. So there are a variety of hooks that we can use to be specified in this app spec file. Basically, all these are triggering points to run that script that we have specified. So if we navigate back, you can see here that before install, we are specifying a location which is under the scripts folder and specifying the stop service.sh file. So this is going to run this when the before install hook is triggered. Now we are also specifying a timeout, which is 180 seconds in this case. We have specified that for all these hooks. So in this case, we are using 3 different. So before install, it's going to stop the service. After the install, it's setting the permissions. And when the application start is triggered, it's starting the service. So let's look at the scripts folder to see these scripts. So the stop service is doing exactly what it's meant to be. It's stopping the My API service and it's removing all the contents that were already deployed in that folder. Now, in the set permissions, it's setting the appropriate permissions that we were again using in our GitHub actions to set up for our My API application. And finally, in the start service, we are using system control to restart the systemd service and enable the My API, and it restarts the API, which again starts the new application. So by this time, we would have copied the files into the folder and it would restart that new application. So the app spec file is controlling the deployment for CodeDeploy. So we're just specifying the scripts and that will be invoked accordingly. Now in our GitHub Actions workflow file, you can see that these files are being specified into the publish folder. You can see that when we zip deploy, these files are being copied accordingly. So we can specify the publish folder. It's copying the appspec YML, My API service, and also all the files under the scripts folder. After which we zip the entire publish folder into My API deploy.zip. This is what is getting uploaded to S3. So let's trigger a new deployment by triggering a git push. So let's navigate into our command line. Let's get the latest version. Now you can see there are 2 commits ahead. So let's push this to our git repository. This is going to trigger a GitHub deployment because we have set up the actions workflow accordingly. So if I switch over to GitHub and navigate to actions for this repository, which is publicly available, you can see the deployment is in progress. So let's navigate to that and we can see the different steps that it's doing as part of this deployment. Now in this case, it has triggered the code deployment and it has failed because it is looking for the appropriate variables. So for this, let's navigate into the settings and update the variables that we require. So let's go to the secrets and variables and specify actions and update the values here. So I have already created the repository secret. So you can see there is a CodeDeploy app name. So let's edit this and let's specify our new app name. So in this case, let's navigate back. The app name is My API. So let's copy that and let's paste it inside here. And let's click update secret. Similarly, we have to update the deployment group. So let's edit that and let's specify the deployment group name. In this case, this is the My API group that we created. So let's update that. We also need to specify the bucket name that we have used. So we have the CodeDeploy bucket. So let's edit that and let's paste the bucket name that we had copied earlier. And let's click update secret. Now, once we have specified these 3, we no longer require the host 1, host 2, etc. So we can safely remove them, which is no longer used in this actions. So let's navigate back to our actions and let's trigger a redeploy of this failed deployment. So let's rerun jobs and specify rerun all jobs. Now this is going to use the latest keys that we have specified in our actions and use that to deploy. So now this is creating the zip and it's uploading the artifact to S3 and now going to trigger this deployment. Now this has triggered the CodeDeploy deployment. So if I navigate back into CodeDeploy and navigate to deployments, you can see that this is in progress. So if we navigate further into this, you can see the multiple instances and that the deployment is in progress. You can also see the different events that's being triggered. So you can see there is a download bundle, before install, etc., which are the hooks that we already saw. Now this deployment is successful and it's deployed this S3 my code artifact myapi.deploy.zip. So if you navigate to the zip file in S3, you can download this and explore the bundle to see the .NET API contents and also the YML file and the service file and the scripts folder that we have packaged as part of the bundle. So now, if we navigate into the EC2 instance, these instances were part of a target group. So let's go to the target group, which we already created in the previous video. So let's navigate to the target group, which is behind a load balancer. We saw all of this in the previous video. So a load balancer is connected to this target group, which means anytime you hit this specific load balancer, it is going to distribute the traffic to either of these instances. So let's navigate further into here and let's go to the URL for this specific load balancer. Let's open this and let's navigate to weather forecast, which is our API endpoint. Now in this case, it has successfully returned the JSON information which our ASP.NET API is returning. So let's navigate back to our application. You can go to the program.cs where we have the API endpoint where it's returning these different values. Now you can add in different values in here. So we have freezing cold and scorching hot, which we had modified. So you can see when we refresh, there is freezing cold and scorching hot. Let's update that to make sure that this is updating when we trigger a new deployment. So let's make this as just cold and let's remove hot from scorching. And let's just save this. This is just to simulate an application change and trigger a new deployment. So let's commit this, updated weather summary. And let's trigger another deployment. So when we do a git push, this is going to again trigger a deployment and deploy the application to CodeDeploy. So let's navigate back to our GitHub actions. You can see there is a new deployment triggered, which will soon trigger another deployment inside our CodeDeploy. So let's navigate back to our CodeDeploy. The update has triggered a new deployment, which is currently in progress. Now this is going to run the removing of the folder and deploy the new application files, which we should be seeing shortly. So this has succeeded. So if I navigate to our API endpoint and refresh this again, you should be seeing just cold and scorching word. So you can see the word here scorching and the cold has not happened in this specific random creation. But we can see that the application is now updated. Now with CodeDeploy, we are now able to use just this actions file to deploy to more instances. Now if you want to create more EC2 instances, all you need to do is update our CDK script, add new instances, which will create new instances into our target group, which will automatically get picked up by our CodeDeploy because we have specified the tag name such that it picks up any of the instances with that stack name. You can also specify this to auto-scaling groups, which we will see in a future video. If you also want to learn about blue-green deployments and how to use that with CodeDeploy, let me know in the comments below. If you like this video, please make sure to hit the like button. If you want to be notified of future such videos, please make sure to hit the subscribe button. It also helps me to grow this YouTube channel. Thank you and see you soon in the next video.